these are some examples from the day 52 assignment. Here we'll be graphing some sine and cosine functions. So here they want us to identify a vertical stretch or compress, or horizontal stretch or compress, and then select the graph. So this graph is stretched vertically by a factor of 3. This is also what they refer to as an amplitude. Here, let's identify. A here is going to be -3. B is 1/6. C is 0, and D, which is the midline, that's also 0. So by a factor of 3, horizontally, we're going to be stretched because the B is 1/6 by a factor of 6, because it's the reciprocal, and we're going to reflect across the x-axis. So normally cosine starts off at its maximum, which is 1, but since this has an amplitude of 3, it would be normally starting at +3. But since it's flipped up the x-axis, then that means it should be starting at -3. So when we look at the y-axis, which is where x is 0, we're looking for a y of 3, and really the only one that has a y of -3. The only one that has that is going to be D. So we know it's going to be D there. But just some other aspects to look at. The midline here is at 0, and the graph goes 3 above it and 3 below it. Also, we go through one full period. A period here is at 2 pi over b. So 2 pi divided by 1/6 is the same thing as saying 2 pi times 6, which is 12 pi. So I should go through one full revolution and back in 12 pi radians. And they tell me 12 pi is approximately 37.7, and sure enough, it does take, if you look here, it does take until 37.7 to go through a full revolution. So the answer here is D. What did I not answer? There's more on the bottom? Oh, period. Okay, well, I already answered the period. The period is 12 pi. Remember, period is 2 pi over b. Okay, same thing now, but for a sine function. So let's identify A. Oh, sorry, the smartboard's giving me some trouble here writing. So A is going to be 1/3. B is going to be 2. C is still 0, and D is still 0. So the graph is vertically compressed now by a factor of 1/3. That 1/3 is the amplitude. And horizontally, it's going to be also compressed. And since this book makes you write it as a reciprocal, the reciprocal of 2 is 1/2. So the sine function normally starts at its midline. My midline here is 0 because D is 0. There has been no vertical flip, so the first thing a sine function does after the midline is it goes up to its maximum, back to the midline, and then down to its minimum, and then back to the midline. It goes mid, max, mid, min, and then mid again. So the midline would be 0. I would be going as high as 1/3. Going up first as 1/3, and then going down as low as -1/3, and then one full period, a period here, is going to be 2 pi over b, which is 2, which is going to be pi. I should go through one full cycle in pi radians. Pi we know is about 3.14. So let's see, it looks like B is the best candidate because it goes up first. So up, down, and back, and it does it in 3.14 radians. So that's our answer is going to be B. Oh, I have to put the period again. I keep on forgetting that. The period we said is going to be pi. Yeah. Period is pi. Okay, so enter an equation for this graph. So now we're going to have to identify A, B, C, and D. And we're going to have to figure out whether it's a, so let's go ahead, let's write A, B, X minus plus. So here's my A, then I need my trig function, sine or cosine, of B, X minus C, and D. All right, so the first thing I'm going to look at is what's happening at the y-axis. I see here on the y-axis, and just by the way, since sine and cosine are co-functions, if there's really an infinite amount of ways to write this, so this is not one of my favorite problems in the book, but we should be able to get it right. So let's see, we start off at the y-axis at 0, so this tells me that this should be a sine function. I should be looking at writing sine. Since the first thing, as I go to the right, the first thing we do is increase, we go up. That tells me that A should be positive. And since we go up as high as 3, my amplitude should be 3. Also, I can tell that the midline here, what's in the, if you're not sure what the midline is, the way you can find the midline from a graph is you can do max plus min and then divide by 2. So the max here is 3. It goes as low as -3. So 3 plus -3 over 2 is 0 over 2, which is 0. So I know that my D is going to be 0. Now, because we've said that this is a sine function, because it's starting here at 0, 0, that means no phase shift should have occurred. I shouldn't have shifted anywhere because I'm starting where I'm supposed to start. If I wanted to name this a cosine, then I would have to have a phase shift, moving it left to right. But for now, we're going to put that C is 0, and I just have to figure out what B is. The way that you would figure out what B is by using your period. You know that the period is equal to 2 pi over B, which normally we use in order to find the period, but now I'm going to use this to find B. The period here is 1 full cycle. It looks like I go through 1 full cycle in 0.4. So I would write, let me see where I can have more space here. I would write 0.4 is equal to 2 pi over B, which if I were to cross multiply, it tells me that 0.4b is equal to 2 pi. And if I divide both sides by 0.4, 2 pi divided by 0.4 should be 10 pi, but let's double check that. 2 divided by 0.4, no, it's 5 pi. So B is equal to 5 pi, and the pi does have to be there. Oh, wow, this smartboard is giving me problems. All right, let's see if we can write this in now. Y equals 3 sine 5 pi x. There's no need for a parentheses because C is 0 and there's no adding at the end, so that should be it. Okay, write an equation for this graph. So same thing as the last time. It looks like the midline here is going to be again at 0, so I know my D is 0. I look at the y-axis and I see that at the y-axis this is at one of its extremes. It's at the minimum. So that tells me that this is going to be a cosine. The D we said is 0, that's the midline. since I'm at the minimum first on cosine, that means that my A should be negative, and I go down and down as low and up as high as 0.2. So let me put that in blue. So this should be negative 0.2 should be the A. The C, since we're assuming that this is cosine, that means no phase shift has occurred. It's starting where cosine is supposed to start. It hasn't slid to the left or right, so this should be 0 again. And then the way I would find the B is to use the period, which here this goes through one full cycle in 1.57, which they tell us 1.57 is pi over 2. So I would say pi over 2 is equal to 2 pi over B. And now I can cross multiply. I can say that B pi is equal to 2 times 2, which is 4 pi. The pi's would cancel, and I get that B is 4. And the smart board's out of whack. So negative 0.2 cosine 4x. There is no need for the parentheses because C is 0, and then there's no D either. Did the point not come out? Point 2. Let's try that again. That should be correct. Negative 0.2. This is cosine. The period is pi over 2. And that equals 2 pi over B. Yeah, this should be equals cosine of 4x. And okay, this is why you got to read the directions. Enter the value for A as a fraction. So okay, so 0.2 as a fraction is 1 over 5. Let's try that. Negative 1 over 5. Okay, let's try this again. Negative 1 over 5, because that's the same as saying negative 0.2 cosine 4x. Okay, let's answer some questions here. For this function, identify the period, midline, amplitude, and then for one cycle of the function, identify where the graph crosses the midline, as well as the maximum and minimum points, and then select the graph. So, okay, here's my function. It says f of x is equal to negative 2 sine of x plus pi, and then plus 3. So the period is going to be 2 pi over b. My b here is 1, so that's just going to be 2 pi. My period is 2 pi. My midline I could get from looking at the function. The midline is d, which d here is 3. So let's see, 2 pi. The midline is y equals 3. And the amplitude, which is the positive version of whatever number's in front, is just going to be 2. Amplitude is how high and how low it goes. So now they want these key points as to what's the first time it's going to cross the midline, second time it crosses the midline, third, maximum, and minimum. and they want us to enter that. Is it going to be as an ordered pair? Identify the period for one cycle. Identify where the graph crosses the midline as well as the maximum minimum. So select the graph. Enter in terms of pi. I guess they want to center it as points. So just to give you an idea of what we're looking at a sine function that the a is negative. So the first thing it's going to do is go down. So it looks like this. So this is going to be the first mid. Then we're going to do a min. Then we go back to the second mid. Then a max. And then finally a mid again. So we can use transformations for this. That's what we'll do. We'll use transformations. So let's identify A, B, C, and D. A is going to be -2, B is 1, C is -pi, and D is 3. Okay. So I'm going to get my normal starting points for sine, and then I'm going to apply these transformations, which is, it's one way of doing it. So normally for sine, the first point is at 0, 0. That's normally the first mid. Then normally you go up to, let's see, if it's going through one full cycle and 2 pi, then the first one would be, the first key point would be pi over 2, comma 1. Then you go back to the middle at pi 0. Then you go to 3 pi, and you can confirm these by looking at the list of trig values. Take the sine of 3 pi over 2. Take the sine of pi over 2. Take the sine of pi. These are the values you get. And then finally you go back to where you started at 2 pi, comma 0. So let's apply transformations here. The 0, 0 is gonna, and actually all the midlines are only gonna be, should only be affected by the phase shift. Well, actually, yeah, all of the x's are. Yeah, let's not confuse anybody. Let's just do our regular transformations. So, all right. All of the x's are going to be divided by b as they always have, but b is 1, so all I got to do is add c, which is subtract pi. So I'm going to be 0 minus pi, pi over 2 minus pi, pi minus pi, 3 pi over 2 minus pi, and then 2 pi minus pi. All of the y's, those would be the easier ones. You could do the transformations if you'd like. It's going to be times -2 plus 3. So 0 times -2 plus 3. But I know 0 times anything is 0, so you'll see that it's not going to have much of an effect. This is 1 times -2 plus 3. 0 times -2 plus 3. -1 times -2 plus 3. And then 0 times -2 plus 3. Okay. The midline's at 3. So 0 minus pi is going to be -pi. 0 times -2 is 0, plus 3 is 3. So you can see all the midlines are going to end up at 3. Since the amplitude is 2, then you'll see that, like here, when I go down to the bottom, 1 times -2 is -2, but plus 3 is going to be 1 for the y's. Pi minus 2 minus pi is -pi over 2. So -pi over 2, and then positive 1. If my middle's at 3, if my middle here is at 3 and I go down 2, then I'm going to end up at 1. So we know that the highest we're going to end up is 5. Pi minus pi is 0, comma, and then here we end up with 3. 3 pi over 2 minus pi is pi over 2. If you can do LCD if you need it. This is -1 times -2 plus 3 is 5. And then 2 pi minus pi is pi, and then we get 3. So those are going to be the 5 key points. The first midline crossing is at negative pi comma 3. The second midline crossing was at 0 comma 3. And at the end, the last midline crossing when we did one full cycle was going to be at pi comma 3. My minimum was when I first went down, that's going to be at negative fraction pi over 2 comma 1. And then my maximum is going to be at fraction pi over 2 comma 5. So now if we go find these points on the graph, I'll focus on the midline. So we have a midline of 3, and it's supposed to be going down first and then up. So that has to be well, we also underwent a phase shift. Yeah, you got to look at the points. You have to actually look at the points. So now I know that it's a sine function. So B and D are both cosine functions. Yeah, there's only one that it has to be A. It has to be, but wait, but it underwent a phase shift. Maybe because the phase shift was pi. Maybe it has to be A. Let's see if that's where the points are. Let's just confirm the points. Negative pi comma 3, negative 3.14 comma 3. Yeah, that's one of them. 0 comma 3. Up, that's there also, and pi comma 3 is there as well. Then here we have negative pi over 2 comma 1, and we do have pi over 2 comma 5. So it is A. Okay, so let's same thing. Let's identify the period, the midline, all that other good stuff. So let's identify A, B, C, and D. My A here is 3. My B is 3. My C is 0 because there's no parentheses. So there's no phase shift. And then my D is 1. That's the midline. The period is going to be, period is 2 pi over B, which B is 3. So my period is 2 pi over 3. Fraction 2 pi over 3. The midline is at D, which is y equals 1. And the amplitude is the positive, whatever A is but positive. And in this case, A was already positive, so it's going to be 3. So now let's look for these key points. We can use transformations again. A cosine function that hasn't flipped starts off at a maximum, goes down to the midline, down to the min, back to the midline, back to the maximum. So I need to find max, mid, min, mid, and max. There should be 2 maxes, 2 mids, and then 1 min, 1 minimum. So let's start off with some, what we used to call parent points, and then transform them. So we normally start off with cosine at 1 comma 0 comma 1. 0 comma 1. Then we go to pi over 2, comma 0. Then we go to pi negative 1. Then we go to 3 pi over 2, back to 0. And then we go to 2 pi and 1. You can confirm all these on the calculator if you'd like. Take the cosine of 0, cosine of pi over 2, cosine of pi. You'll see that's what we get. So now let's perform the transformations. The x's are supposed to be divided by b, which here we do have one. We had 3, and then add c, but c is 0. So all we have to do to these is divide by 3. So 0 divided by 3, comma pi over 2 divided by 3, which is the same as times 1/3, comma pi divided by 3, 3 pi over 2, and then times a 1/3, comma 2 pi divided by 3. The y's are going to get times a and plus d. So 1 times 3 plus 1, squeeze it in there. 0 times 3 plus 1, negative 1 times 3 plus 1, 0 times 3 plus 1, 1 times 3 plus 1. 0 divided by 3 is 0. 1 times 3 plus 1 is 4. Pi over 2 times 1/3 is pi over 6. 0 times 3 plus 1 is 1. Pi over 3 stays as pi over 3. Negative 1 times 3 is negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2. For this, the 3's cancel out, so I end up with pi over 2, comma 1. And then 2 pi over 3 stays the same. 1 times 3 plus 1 is 4. So those are the key points after the transformations. 0, comma 4. And actually, oops, I did that wrong. They want the first. That's going to be the first maximum. So the first midline, the first time we hit the midline is at pi over 6, comma 1. That's the second point. Pi over 6, comma 1. The second midline crossing is at pi over 2, comma 1. The minimum is the one in the middle. That's going to be pi over 3, comma negative 2. The first maximum is going to be at 0, 4. That's where we start off at. And the second maximum at the end is at 2 pi over 3. Two pi over 3, comma 4. When you plot these points and put them on a graph, let's see, C is a flipped cosine, D is a sine function, so it has to be between A and B. The one that has a midline at 1 and goes with an amplitude of 3 up or 3 down is going to be A. see if there's any more questions towards the bottom. That should be it. And now the last one. Write a cosine equation for this function. So, okay, let's identify A, B, C, and D. At least they already tell us it's cosine. So we're going to have something. I mean, they already put the f of x equals in front. So, f of x is equal to something cosine something x minus something plus something, where those somethings are A, B, C, and D. Okay, the first thing I would like to look at is my midline. It looks like my midline here is going to be 3, but if you're not sure, do maximum, which is 6, minimum, which is 0, divided by 2. This is 6 plus 0 divided by 2 is 3. So I'm going to have a midline of 3. Then the way that you can find your amplitude A is you can subtract the max minus mid. You can do max minus mid, or you can do mid minus. You can do mid minus min. So since here I know my middle is at 3, I can just do 6 minus 3, which is 3. So I'm also going to have an amplitude of 3. Since cosine normally starts at its maximum, and if I look at the y-axis, it is at its maximum, no flip has occurred, so that's going to stay positive, and also no phase shift has occurred. So we're going to say it hasn't slid left or right. It's starting where it's supposed to start, so the only thing left to find is that b. So we can use our formula for period. It looks like we go through one full period here in 6.29. 6.29 is about 2 pi. So the period would be 2 pi over 2 pi, and that's just going to be 1. So I don't need to write the 1 or the 0. So this would just be 3 cosine plus 3. 3 cosine of x plus 3. Just let me write this down also here for you. 1, 0, 3.